Okay, good afternoon, everyone. You're all very welcome to UCD in Conversation. My name is Tasman Crowe, and I'm the director of the UCD Earth Institute, which is UCD's Institute for Environmental and Sustainability Research. This series reflects UCD's Rising to the Future strategy and its 4 pillars, which are creating a sustainable global society, transforming through digital technology, building a healthy world, and empowering humanity. And today's webinar will be roughly an hour long and will include a Q&A at the end. So please submit your questions at any time during the conversation using the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen. This episode is going to focus specifically on the responses to the climate crisis in the context of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs. And the 17 SDGs were adopted by all 193 member states of the United Nations through a process that we discussed last week in the UCD in Conversation series. And they serve as a universal call to action to end poverty, protect the planet, and create a blueprint to achieve a better and more sustainable future for all. Through the Rising to the Future strategy, UCD embeds the SDGs across its education, research, governance, and engagement activities. This episode, in collaboration with UCD Alumni Relations, picks up from the UCD SDG seminar series, which the Earth Institute hosted in 2019 and 2020, and which brought together academics, alumni, and stakeholders to explore the research needs for addressing each of the goals. And you can actually find the link for records of those in the chat there now. So now I'm just going to hand over to Dr. Andrew Jackson, who's going to lead this conversation and will introduce us to our expert panelists. Andrew himself is an assistant professor in environmental law in the UCD Sutherland School of Law, with broad research interests at international, EU, and Irish levels. Andrew's been involved in public interest environmental and planning litigation for many years, including before the Irish, English, and EU courts. His previous roles include working for a large law firm in London and Paris, for the UK government's Department for the Environment, DEFRA, and as an in-house lawyer for a leading environmental NGO in Ireland. And more recently, Andrew acted for the successful litigant in the landmark climate case Ireland for the Supreme Court of Ireland in 2020, having identified the idea for the case through his research. And he's also recently contributed a chapter to a new edited collection on national framework climate legislation. So over to you, Andrew.
Thanks, Taz. Thanks very much for that introduction. And welcome everyone joining us today. We have 2 very distinguished panelists today, I'm delighted to say. We have Sive O'Neill, who's an assistant professor at the School of Law and Government at DCU, where Sive lectures in climate policy and politics. And we have John Bell, who is the Healthy Planet Director of DG Research and Innovation at the European Commission in Brussels. And John was the 2019 recipient of UCD's Alumni Award in Research, Innovation and Impact. So you're both very welcome, Sive and John. I'd like to start by asking you please to speak a bit about your backgrounds, your careers to date, and your current work on the climate crisis. I know you both started off studying English and philosophy as undergraduates. So if you could maybe tell us, how did you get from there to where you are now and the work that you're doing now? Maybe if I could go to John first, please.
Thanks, Andrew, and hi, nice to meet you, Sive. It's probably a bit of a mystery to my former teachers at UCD, but actually what we learned at UCD, apart from being resilient, was how to think in English and philosophy. You learn how to do systems thinking, you learn how to read carefully, pay attention to language, and you also learn that narrative is very powerful when it's properly anchored. So it's been a great help. UCD, I did English, and then I did Anglo-Irish studies. I worked on national identity and Flann O'Brien for 2 years, and I probably needed therapy after that. Went over to England, as everybody did in the 80s, and ended up in Oxford, where I did a doctorate on, again, national identity on Heaney. And again, what you're taught in English and philosophy is just to look at systems and to look at transitions and to look at and to read things carefully. And that prepared me for really, when I came to the European Union for the Commission, we're fairly resilient people, the children of the 80s, and I ended up working on enlargement in Poland. Again, that was about looking at how you bring together change and transition. And after that, I worked on setting up these public health institutes that we're depending on now in the pandemic and dealing with public health legislation and tobacco control as a non-lawyer. But it was those skills that were given. And then last but not least, what I do now, it's a good question. What are the KPIs on a healthy planet? I mean, the basic idea is that we have to shift research and innovation as everything else has to shift in the same direction. We're running out of time. We're not running out of ideas. So what we're trying to do is to commission different kinds of systems of understanding. So we need to know where we are, you know, what kind of observation systems do we need to know in real time and locally and available to people to understand what's happening, what will happen, what could happen, and how do we mobilize people and engage them in that, and then how do we actually produce future possible solutions and pathways for decision makers and investors to work on. So that's as quickly as I can kind of go through all of that. I should also say that I met my wife at UCD when we set up the James Joyce Summer School, and I was back at Moly for our 30th anniversary wedding date. So I thank UCD for not just my education and the opportunity, but for making all of this possible. So thanks for the opportunity to talk and listen today, Andrew. Thanks.
Thanks very much, John. And Sive, so you started from a similar disciplinary background, and you're now, of course, in academia, but passing through the worlds of politics and advocacy and environmental NGOs. So could you tell that story, please?
Yes, I don't know if I have such a romantic dimension to it as John, but I did my degree actually in Trinity, and I was always very interested in politics and quite quickly got politically active, but my interests in going to study were very much in the kind of areas that John was just speaking about, actually, the kind of the big picture stuff, you know, the role of literature in shaping our culture and our ideas and our possibilities and our identities and sense of who we are. And that's particularly empowering to women, of course. Reading through women's literature in the late 80s was a big deal, you know, and learning that kind of role, learning to play the role of a constructive critic, which is a hugely, it's a big skill in philosophy, to learn to read and engage and dialogue in the sort of Socratic sense with texts and also with other people. The idea of being able to construct an argument and take it all the way to a conclusion and convince other people along the way. So initially, my interests in Trinity were actually in the philosophy of science, and that led me into kind of ecological philosophy and many, many different aspects of that. And I spent some years then in UCD as a postgrad, but didn't finish that because I had been quite distracted in Trinity with my political activities, and managed to get myself elected to Dublin City Council quite by accident at the age of 20. So I wasn't quite finished my undergraduate degree at that point. So I spent 5 years on Dublin City Council as a Green Party councillor. And from there, I went to work in a variety of environmental campaign groups. I suppose I was convinced already by the power of politics with a small p, the idea that civil society can mobilize and you know, constructively engage with the policy system and policy frameworks and bring new ideas and new people into politics, creating new spaces for dialogue, engagement, and also this idea of putting pressure, because the political system can only respond when there is public pressure. And I was very much aware of that as an elected representative, how easily isolated and cut off public representatives can be from the preferences of the very people who elect them. So I spent quite a number of years working in different campaign groups in and out, and took a long stint out as a parent and as a yoga teacher, and then came back in 2013 or 2014 to UCD to do a master's in public affairs, philosophy and public affairs it was. So more philosophy, and then started a PhD in political philosophy. So I kind of took a long winding route into academic politics. But I had the opportunity over the past few years to work with some really exciting campaigns. I worked with you, Andrew, on the climate case. I've also worked in the Oireachtas as a policy advisor, and more recently as a policy advisor to the Stop Climate Chaos Civil Society Coalition. And now I'm in DCU researching and lecturing again. So interesting to be here, and thank you so much for the invitation.
Thanks, Sive. And I know very recently you were at COP26 in Glasgow, where the UN Secretary General Guterres gave this remarkable speech towards the beginning of the COP, where he said, "Our addiction to fossil fuels is pushing humanity to the brink. We face a stark choice: either we stop it or it stops us. It's time to say enough. Enough of brutalizing biodiversity, enough of killing ourselves with carbon, enough of treating nature like a toilet, enough of burning and drilling and mining our way deeper. We are digging our own graves," which are really very stark words from a UN Secretary General. So my question for both of you is, have we stopped digging in Ireland and in Europe? And where do we stand now in terms of limiting global heating to 1.5 degrees? Maybe I'll go first to you, Sive, with that question.
Yeah, they're quite striking words from the UN Secretary General, and it's an interesting the kind of language he uses, because he's trying to galvanize action with the power of rhetoric, essentially, because he doesn't have any political authority. And that's the really sad part of it all, that he cannot make countries do what they should be doing. No, there is no world government. We're very much relying on the pressure that states put on each other and from civil society, from domestic electorates, to get them to do the kind of things that are necessary and that they know are necessary. So even with all of those fine words, the current policies in place today after the COP will at best lead to 2.6 or so degree rise in global temperatures by 2100, which, as we know, is absolutely devastating in terms of the risks it poses for human security, for biodiversity, and we're heading into unknown territory and creating all kinds of other risks of future tipping points that could drive and accelerate global warming beyond our ability to bring it back. That's the thing. It is not a process that we can manage and control. So the risks and the kind of approach we are taking are really at a scale that are ungovernable. So I think we need to recognize that our approach to this in terms of saying, well, we think that 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees is an acceptable risk is no longer tenable, because the scientific consensus is clear that the global warming that's already baked into the system of over 1 degree is responsible for serious catastrophic weather events that we have seen unfolding around the world in 2020. It has played a role in driving up the risk of global pandemics. And while we're all still immersed in this one, there's no guarantee that there won't be another one in the next couple of years that could be even more serious. So the reality is, in terms of have we stopped digging? No, we haven't. The policies are not adequate to the challenge. And it is difficult because some progress has been made, clearly, and there are lots of new commitments. But when you look in detail at what those commitments entail, they often aren't fleshed out in enough detail. They still involve, continuation of burning coal, for example, for another decade or so. And certainly post-COVID, we're seeing a significant rebound in greenhouse gas emissions, including from Ireland, with an estimated 14% GDP growth rate for 2021. I know we have weird economic growth statistics, but the likelihood is that that is a boom that will further drive up emissions. So the reality is that even though we have improved governance measures in place in Ireland and across the EU, and even though further directives and policies and programs are coming, the reality is that the measures that we've adopted haven't yet kicked in. We haven't been able to get them up and running fast enough to deliver the reductions that are needed in the timescales available. So we're already in the kind of well into the first carbon budget period in Ireland, and we haven't seen any emission reductions coming, and the projected emission growth has not been really taken off its trajectory at all. So I think we have some serious questions to ask of the political system, because the political system is still doing double speak on lots of aspects of climate policy. So they want to achieve the targets, but at the same time, they want more data centres, more dairy expansion, and more road building. And that's just not tenable. So we have to bite the bullet, I suppose, and end our investment in lock-in or fossil fuel infrastructure that's just very difficult to get out of once we build it, and start to divert our resources, our expenditure, and our policies towards greening the infrastructure and transforming the economic and environmental practices that we've known for a long time need to be done to protect our biodiversity and bring emissions down. So a lot of, as John said, a lot of the policies, a lot of the information is already there. We just simply have been too slow to act on it. And the political system has been very, very conservative and reluctant to kind of take the decisive steps that are needed.
Thanks, sorry. John, what's your take on where we stand now?
There's very little I would disagree with in what Sive has said. So my teams are working on, they work in the provision of the IPCC working groups, COP. I have people working on the Arctic. We work on oceans, we work on ecosystems, we work on water, and we work north-south in terms of what's going on. So on the one hand, what I see is pretty harrowing. I mean, we just lost a bit of a glacier this week that people may or may not have noticed. I think you have picked that up in social media. What we're understanding, so on the difficulty side, in terms of the gap, in terms of the challenge, in terms of the context, we have this dilemma where, on the one hand, the urgency is systemic, multi-systemic urgency, but the paralysis in front of the urgency, which is actually being stoked by the people who created the problem in the first place, which is one of the nice tricks of the fossil fuel industry, by the way, and nothing can be done. How we get the movement to where we know we want to be and keep people feeling that there's a degree of urgency about it when everybody discounts the future, as we know from behavioral economics, is probably the most difficult challenge for the political system, for citizens, and for everybody who's active in the space. So I try every day and balance things out. So my benchmark is home. I'm probably more optimistic about the fact that we can get there than I was that there would be peace in Ireland during my lifetime when I left Ireland in the 1980s. I'm a lot more optimistic than I was that I would turn up in a country like Ireland now, which is diverse and open and inclusive. So I have to believe that transitions are possible when you can actually engage and involve people, all of the people who are involved in the kind of systemic transitions that are required. So if we take the peace process on the island of Ireland as a very good example, understanding what is going on, having the knowledge, including people, getting ownership, getting buy-in, and then setting an irreversible path in law, in policy, in finance, in civic society is what's needed. So we're way off track. There's, our biodiversity systems are collapsing around us. We have most of our assumptions about most of our life support systems are false. So we are going to see food security problems, probably even in Europe. I don't know, have you seen that the Rhine River dried up 2 summers ago, and they weren't able to ship all of the wonderful GDP out of the heart of the European economy to the ports. We see problems in extreme weather. We see problems in too much water, too little water. We see the pandemic, as Sive has said, is the first and the opening chapter in an interconnected world that hasn't really thought through the systems we put in place. So that's the challenge. The guy who started off the European Union idea, Jean Monnet, said, when you have an insuperable set of problems, you have to change the context. And that's what we have to do now. You have to completely change the context, and you have to do it by design. The plus side and this is where coming from the post-Enlightenment society helps. We're the first civilization who understand our dilemma and that we've created it, and who have the means to actually address it. And the question is whether, how do you exercise the levers of politics and decision making, and in particular in the marketplace, which is very short-termist, which is very difficult in terms of making systemic changes possible. The good news, at least from where I'm sitting, I see around me in Brussels, there's an absolute sea change, there's a systemic change taking place. The European Union, for all its faults, is setting out to make these transitions the reason for the European Union's existence for the next 30 years. There's another line of Guterres that I liked and I use a bit, which is that the main task, and I think this is the main task of Europe and probably the main task of Ireland now, is to make peace with nature. This is our main task as a civilization, and it means mobilizing science and research and law and protest and economics and pricing and all of the other things that are there. The difficult thing is that the political system, in particular, I don't think is designed currently in different places to adapt to that. So I'm what they say, the difference between hope and optimism is a good plan, which a long-term one would be particularly helpful in the case of Ireland. And so that's the space I'm in. I see the knowledge and the data coming in, and I see the effort, and I see the commitment. I mean, the protesters on Friday, they're a block away from where I work, and I see institutional change, but I see north-south, I see the interests of fossil fuel industries and people who are locked in, as I've said, still very powerful, still very embedded, and there's an indifference also to what is coming. I mean, the global south is completely forgotten in this conversation, but they are coming to a place near you quite soon, and in very large numbers if we don't fix this.
Thanks, John. Both of your answers there, I mean, Sive talked about, used the word transforming, and you used the word or the phrase systemic change, and I'd like to pick up on that, if I may, because there's a quote that has really stuck with me for the past couple of years in the context of, you know, the intertwined climate and biodiversity crises that we face. In its first global report in 2019, the biodiversity equivalent of the IPCC said, you know, we're facing these huge crises, and what we need, and this is the quote, is transformative changes across economic, social, political, and technological factors. And it went on to define what it meant by transformative change as a fundamental system-wide reorganization across technological, economic, and social factors, including paradigms, goals, and values. And because of the way that the relevant bodies' decision-making structures work, that conclusion was endorsed by essentially all of the governments of the world, including our own in Ireland. So, you know, we have endorsed the need for fundamental system-wide reorganization across technological, economic, and social factors, including paradigms, goals, and values. So what I'd like to ask both of you is, what does transformative change mean for you in the climate context? And maybe I'll go first to John this time.
By the way, I missed the opportunity for a Seamus Heaney quote in the last intervention. Digging our own graves. I think the question, you know, what are we going to dig with now? And I think, to use that image from his poetry, we have a choice. We can dig our own futures with policies and governance and all kinds of things. IPPS, you talked about, who we're, by the way, supporting to become an IPCC-like body in terms of the ability to get the science in front of policymakers, are absolutely right. I think the first thing about transformative change is it's about the destination that you want to get to. I think it's a demand-led rather than a bottom-up process of getting to a destination that is agreed, consensual, shared, and sustainable. They're all kind of funny words, but I think if you take the peace problem in Northern Ireland is a very good example of something which seems highly improbable and impossible to resolve. But transformative systemic change requires you need to do something which is integrated. It is by consent. It is encapsulating and including all of the aspects of the system in setting the baseline and understanding where you're setting off from. And it's about having some kind of a concept agreement of what the destination looks like quite precisely. So I think if you look at the systems changes that we're looking at here at the moment, the food system is probably the one that is most familiar to people. Food is kind of people's vernacular language. We know that we need to decouple, you know, growth and production in a certain way in the economy. Well, what does that mean in terms of the food system? We have to go to a food system that within 10 years or less than 10 years is post-waste, is massively reducing its impact on carbon, is working in the natural systems without chemical pesticides and without the impact it's having on soil depletion, water depletion, you know, emissions and all the rest. It has to be one that is actually driving a more sustainable and healthy and affordable lifestyle for the people who are in there. So it's all of these elements, but I think what we've tried to do in the European level, and I see there's some movement here in Ireland as well, is to work out what the systemic parts are. If you look at climate, because climate is mainstream and is integrated and dependent on so many different things, you also have to have a systemic change, and we may talk about this later on, which is also involving adaptation and resilience. It's about integrating, and it's about setting out pathways. I think a lot of it, and this I think is the key, and it's the key to the first question as well, is how do you get political ownership of people who are affected by the transition? I think the biggest single systemic change and condition of success is the understanding and buy-in of the people whose systems are about to be changed. And again, I go back to the Northern Ireland peace process as a way of thinking about it, and indeed the other changes here. So yeah, I'll stop there because I could go on. I'll probably go off piste very quickly. Sive.
Thanks, John. So Sive, transformative change.
Well, I was struck by the reference in that quote to technological paradigms, and it reminded me of one of the books that influenced me hugely in my studies, which was a book by Caroline Merchant called The Death of Nature. And it was about the role of science and technology in the post-Enlightenment era in kind of shaping the way we use nature, and we've transformed natural resources. And her argument is that because we think of nature as dead, we can exploit it. We can take whatever we want out of it, things that are in the ground, whether they're aggregates or soils or trees or whatever, it's kind of pretty much dead. And because it's dead, we're not respecting it in any sense, and we're not acknowledging the life forces that we share with all other species. So the other thing is that science and technology are a kind of a double-edged sword. We clearly need them more than ever, but we've also become shaped by technologies in ways that are potentially very harmful and destructive. And as Hans Jonas says, technology is really no longer ethically neutral. So one of the paradigms that I think we need to really take a close look at is our attitude to technology. Because if we think that we can solve the climate crisis with techno fixes, or relying on hydrogen, or relying on some brand new magic type of solar PV cell or something else, I think that it's not going to work. It's a risky strategy because the technologies might not come to be, but also it doesn't really grasp the essential problem, which is that we're not living within our environmental means. We're not managing resources. We don't have a circular economy, so we have all these wastes and pollution. And we're not recognizing scarcity. We're not recognizing that the resources that we need for our survival are actually scarce and need to be managed in an extremely sensitive way. And now economists have loads of ideas on how to manage scarcity. That's what economists do. But in fairness to them, we don't tend to pay much heed to the calls that they make for making polluters pay, putting prices on ecological services, and putting a different way of valuing the role of nature and natural systems across the board, whether that be, fossil fuel damage, or whether it's, the role of carbon in land and in forestry and so on. The other area where I think we need to change our paradigms is we need to start really rethinking our attitude to human rights and rights. We need to think about the rights of nature and the rights of non-humans, non-human species, and the rights of future generations, because it's not just other plant species that are affected by human activities. There are countless numbers of animal, bird, and fish species that are in dire straits thanks to us. And these creatures are sentient, and they experience pain, and the philosophical arguments in favor of acknowledging their rights and their interests are really very powerful, but we conveniently just set them to one side and put them over there with the environmental resources. I also think we need to have a close look at our approach to consumerism. There's so much information now highlighting that it's the top, the wealthy elites across society, and not always just in developed countries, but across the world, that are mostly responsible for the greatest share of carbon emissions. And that's not something we pay attention to, because we tend to focus on market instruments, and that as long as people are paying their carbon taxes, it doesn't really matter how much energy they're consuming. But as we head into an era of focused climate action and scarcity of the atmospheric sink that we should be recognizing, we're going to have to do something about managing consumerism and essentially putting a downward squeeze on our energy consumption so that we can afford to get the whole thing running up on renewable energies. I could go on. I think we need to look at ecological tax reform. So if we shift our taxation system towards recognizing and valuing both pollution and sequestration and in ecological services, the knock-on effect of that is to completely change the tax base, and it could be quite a regressive tax base. So we need to shift the way we tax in order to make it fair and to compensate people who might be vulnerable to fuel poverty and energy poverty. But essentially, that's a lot of transformation. You know, it's changing, not so much, these aren't new economic ideas, but they're just ones we've never implemented in any kind of systemic way. And we need to just pull ourselves back from the idea that either technology or markets can fix everything, because they can't.
Thanks, Saeed. If we stay on the theme of transformation, but focusing specifically on institutions, I noticed you published an op-ed last week in the Irish Times in which you argued, amongst other things, that Ireland needs an ombudsperson for the future or for future generations. So my question is, do we have the institutions we need at the moment to address the climate crisis? Maybe go first to Saeed with that one.
Yes, I'm really interested in this area because it's kind of a foundational principle of climate justice, that it's not just justice between countries or within countries, but it's also intergenerational justice. When we have exhausted the carbon budget, which appears likely in the next couple of decades, the carbon budget will be unavailable for any future generations. Not only that, so that means they will never be able to consume any fossil fuels unless they can capture any emissions afterwards. It's just not going to be an option for thousands of years. But not only that, they're going to be confronted with the burden of the climate change as a result of the emissions we've caused and previous generations. So these are some really kind of pressing ethical concerns. And, you know, we're not just talking about far distant future generations, we're talking about our own children here. So when different countries are grasping with these problems, they have, there's a couple of different institutional options available. Hungary, for example, has quite a powerful ombudsman that has investigative powers and can scrutinize proposals and is actually elected by the Hungarian parliament for a 6-year period. Wales have adopted, I think, kind of weak legislation, but it's still innovative in its own terms. They have a commissioner for future generations whose mandate is to make sure that public bodies are all collectively working towards the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. But the commissioner doesn't have a lot of powers. So really, if you're going to set up an institution to look at these things, I think they would need to have a clear mandate, not only to scrutinize policies and give advice to government, but also to scrutinize scrutinize budgetary proposals and to investigate complaints. And that could be an interesting place for the types of litigation actions that I know you're interested in, Andrew, where younger people are trying to exercise their rights in the courts, but it's quite difficult for them to find legal avenues to pursue those cases, and they can take a very long time. But if an ombudsman could actually investigate them, because the current ombudsman for children, for example, doesn't have a remit in relation to future impacts. It's only harms that are being carried out by public bodies at this moment. So I think there is potential for this. I've spoken to one TD who's interested in drafting a private members bill, and I'd hope to work on that with him in 2022 and progress that somehow or another. We'll have to work on it.
Interesting, thanks, Si. John, so the question of institutions.
Yeah, I think that at the heart of what Si was saying, there's something quite important, which is there's a kind of a strategic space there which doesn't neatly fit into the kind of Victorian institutions that we have grown up in. I don't know where time fits into the definition of the Constitution or institutions and so forth. It's supposed to be one of the remits of a state that you provide stability and continuity and some kind of sense of security for people over time. But the problem is that the medium and long term is fundamentally at odds with the present, and that is a basic problem. I look at Ireland in different ways. So at one level, as a citizen, I'm probably one of the few people you met who's deprived of a vote. I haven't been allowed to vote in an election since 1992 because the state doesn't give a vote to European officials. Not that we're the worst case scenario there, but there didn't seem to be a way of fixing things like that. On the other hand, I see the evolution. I mean, again, the Good Friday Agreement, the ability to respond when it's necessary gives me some grounds that institutional reform can go in the right direction. I see very interesting bodies which are there, the Climate Council, this decision-making board. You start to see amongst the universities, the Biodiversity and Climate All-Ireland group, you start to see the formation of new kinds of institutions. I simply don't know. I don't live in Ireland. I don't know, do they meet frequently enough? Do they have the mandate? Are they accountable enough? Are they connected enough? That at one level. At another level, what I do see is it's quite difficult to engage. So for example, we're running a number of these transformative missions in Horizon Europe at the moment. So these are kind of moonshots where we use research innovation to massively jumpstart transformation involving the public, and not just technology, but one of them is 100 climate neutral cities by 2030. How do you speak to Dublin? We've got no cities signed up from Ireland because the cities in some way are municipally defined. I mean, Si, you worked in this space, but they're dependent on central government. So I don't know what the answer to that is. Who's responsible for climate adaptation resilience in terms of setting out, we'll take a city like Cork or Dublin, if sea level rise is going to be as it is, then how would you make decisions at that level involving the public that require huge investments over time and very difficult decisions of social justice? I mean, I understand, I don't know if this is correct, Andrew, did people really use the Constitution to lower the seawall in Clontarf? So I think, is the Constitution climate proofed? Or do we wait for unenumerated rights to step in and do our work for us? I think the important thing, as Si was saying, is to intergenerationally interrogate the institutions and the processes that we have, see what works and build on them, and then see what needs to be changed. But I suspect there's work to be done there. I think there's very good people in the system, both in the political system, the civil society system, and around it in academia and so forth. But whether the system is fit for purpose is something we're all about to discover.
Thanks, John. I mean, on the question of the Constitution, interestingly, there is an active campaign to have a right to a safe, clean and healthy environment recognised explicitly in the Constitution. And the forum in which that might be discussed would be the Citizens' Assembly on biodiversity loss, which was promised in the programme for government, and that question of constitutional change may make it onto the agenda in due course of the Citizens' Assembly. Sorry, John, you wanted to come back in?
Yeah, I want on that and on something Si said. I think because we'll talk about adaptation later, and I'm finding it slightly worrying that it's not properly integrated in this. But I think one of the answers to the intergenerational trade-off is to have a rights-based approach to resilience, both individually and collectively and generationally, and to find a way of working out at all levels, including at the Constitution, that resilience would mean, for example, that based on what Sai was saying, you know, the next generation should have access to the same kind of rights as we have, and to work something out which actually builds the time and the conflict, and then try and work out, well, what does that mean in terms of policy and investment and taxes and all of the other things that people are doing. I think the issue of resilience as a rights-based approach is maybe a space that, I mean, adaptation is going to be about resilience in all kinds of ways, but in terms of how you resolve some of these intergenerational issues, or maybe part of that could be, so I don't remember growing up, people used to take the pledge. Maybe people could actually sign up intergenerationally to take the pledge for resilience and actually start giving something back to the next generation in a fairly organized way. But there's a right space in that institutional question, which I'm certainly not skilled enough to address, but somehow around resilience being a social, collective, institutional, individual right, and that you reorganize your society in some way over time around making that possible in the way that we've done with diversity and identity and various other things. I don't know. And by the way, globally it applies as well. That's where we all get into really big trouble.
I think certainly on the question of rights, the courts are leading the way there, and the German Federal Constitutional Court picked up on something that our own Supreme Court said recently, in finding an infringement of fundamental rights, where a group of young people brought a case where Germany had a pretty ambitious 2030 target of 55% reduction by 2030, but Germany's highest court said, look, that's not good enough, because you haven't set out a pathway beyond 2030 to 2050, such that essentially you are offloading too much onto the future. You know, you're not taking on enough of a burden in the current generation, and you're offloading far too much onto the future, and that in itself is an infringement of rights. If we go to this question of adaptation that you mentioned, John, there's a lot of focus on climate mitigation in climate policy discussions, but somewhat less on adaptation. In its annual review published just last week, our National Climate Change Advisory Council said it was unable to give the highest score for adaptation progress to any sector in Ireland. And given the shocking news you already mentioned, John, about the Thwaites Glacier in the Antarctic, whose collapse would raise sea levels by some 65 centimetres, what should we be doing now on the adaptation side? And when it comes to these questions, adaptation and mitigation, as an island nation, should we be thinking on an all-island basis about these questions? And Said, maybe for this one person, then John, thanks.
I probably have less to say about this than John might, but clearly we have enough information about the kind of climate risks that Ireland will be exposed to, and there's very little sense of adaptation having much in the way of traction. Local authorities have had adaptation plans under the old legislation, but they haven't been the kind of plans that have elicited lots of public participation in terms of submissions and commentary. And I've heard a number of people say, well, that these are just engineering problems. And some of the issues that arise may be engineering problems, but clearly there's a bigger question about how we're going to manage the inevitable deluges of water that we can expect from extreme surges, extreme rainfall events, storm events. And Ireland, just with our topography in certain parts of the country, are particularly prone to flooding. So the problem at the moment is that it's not obvious who's responsible for this. The OPW has a kind of overall responsibility in terms of mapping and assessing risk and conducting kind of cost-benefit analysis for what can be done to offset risks in certain places. But these are not necessarily done in a consultative manner where the local community are on board with their answers. And there are many, many rural communities where you don't have a sufficient critical mass of population to justify any interventions at all. So the problem is how to manage that, how to engage people, and also how to recognize the fact that the nature conservation side of the state tends to take a hands-off approach and doesn't want to get involved. So when these events happen, people are left floundering. They don't know who to turn to. They don't know where to get advice. They don't know what rights they have in terms of state support. And everything is managed on a kind of humanitarian basis, which is completely, unacceptable in the 21st century, when we know that the likelihood of these events taking place will be more serious. Longer term, I think, looking to the risk of climate change for Ireland, we're going to see more rainfall, but also more drought. So that has to have an impact on our approach to land use. And again, the expansion of dairy farming makes no sense because we don't know how we're going to feed all these cattle. We'll have to import more feed, and then you have the knock-on effect of additional synthetic fertilizer contributing to emissions. So land use practices generally and land management and development are things that we have always had, that have been very contested in Irish local politics. And I don't think we have arrived yet at the suitable mechanism for making these trade-offs in a way that respects the kind of environmental limits that exist locally and also the environmental risks. So I don't have any clear answers, but it's quite obvious that the direction of travel is letting the water flow, using nature-based solutions for water management and land management, increasing dramatically the amount of area that is allowed to be covered by forestry, either commercial forestry or also by rewilding. And so that whole changes in land use practices, I think, it covers the adaptation space potentially quite well. But there is no consensus, and there are some very difficult political decisions that need to be made.
Thanks, Ive. So, John, adaptation, all-island approach, any thoughts on these issues?
Maybe, I think Cy was right about a lot of that. I think, again, to move into the you need to have a transition only works when you're moving somewhere better, I think. One of the examples, the Netherlands put together a map of what the Netherlands would look like in 50 years and 100 years time if they applied every available nature-based solution and change to the country. And they published it in the main newspaper on New Year's Day, and there was a huge and very positive debate about how would we do this, because the only other map they'd seen was the Al Gore map, which is basically blue. Because the waters had taken the country. And I think this is part of this. So number one, I think part of all of these strands is to actually collectively envisage what kind of literally what kind of an island, and I mean an island, do we want to live on in 10, 20, 30 years? Applying a number of things that are annoying the hell out of people. What kind of cities do we want to live in? What kind of housing do we want to have? What kind of water, countryside, and all of those things. The second thing is, I hear a lot about the future of the island, naturally enough, but it's never about the island. And I think we need to start thinking about ourselves, strangely enough, as people who live on an island, including with our neighbours, because weather, climate, heat, health issues for plants, animals, for people, the way in which our infrastructure is set out, the consequences, which by the way are going to be abrupt. This is one of these ideas about transformation, that it's linear, that nature is going to work in a linear way. And most of the scientists I meet have no idea what sea level rise is actually going to be and when it's going to take place, in what way, just to take one example. But what we've seen from weather is we know we're going to have major disruptions to food systems, for example. So let's imagine that Ireland wanted to be the green heart of the Green Deal and actually put in place all of the transformative measures that we want to see in agriculture and food and all the rest. How would we deal with the fact that we may have catastrophic levels of rain that even Frank McCourt couldn't describe, or massive shortages? And so one of the things to do is to first of all build the knowledge that is needed by people who need the decisions to affect them, put it in place. So this is part of what we do in the research innovation community, is we're trying to create the right kind of observation systems where you get what Frank McGovern in UCD calls authoritative local knowledge for decision making at the level and scale and precision that you need. So if you see that your neighborhood will be valueless, you know, Ireland is still addicted to property, but will be valueless if there are not fundamental transformative changes. I mean, do we need to build a wetland in Dublin Bay if the sea level rise? I don't know. How would you get there? So I think in all of this, on adaptation, you're talking about resilience, and you're talking about the need to be organized in a way that you've got the kind of evidence that you need, and you need a political process that is local and involving, and that is informed, and decision making which can then make the investments that can help. And the most important thing in this is that the adaptation process has to reinforce the mitigation process. So if you think about the most sensitive issue, it seems, politically in Ireland is very often the bogs and the peatlands, which is an enormous opportunity for Ireland and the island of Ireland even in decades to come, through restoration and through re-wetting and that to generate new economic activity in the Midlands in places that have had no activity for a long period of time. But it also is part of the solution if you have excessive flooding coming from poorly managed rivers and so forth. You can work out systems where you can hold water, you can generate systems if you have the public involvement. I'll stop with a very specific two examples. One is in the Netherlands, where they have worked out the city as a sponge, and so they've designed with neighborhoods that all of their guttering and all this is connected into underground water systems, which then that benefit the water features, they water the local parks and all the rest. But it just holds the water for long enough so that it doesn't flood the systems when they go in. And the neighborhoods in turn, they all have to commit to doing something practical. So one of the things they're doing is they're taking up the tiles in their driveways and their gardens so that the water is absorbed everywhere when it comes to the city, as a civic act in terms of being part of a city as a sponge. Second thing we're working on at the moment is a mission on climate adaptation, where we're trying to have 150 climate resilient regions in Europe who will both understand their risks, have demonstrated solutions available to them, and then have the investment and the means to transform whatever needs to be transformed, whether it's by nature or in other ways, to address these issues. But again, who do you talk to in Ireland at a regional level to talk about being one of those leading regions? So I think adaptation is with us. The problem politically is people try and say, well, let's just give up on mitigation. We're doomed, and let's move on to building cities on stilts and nonsense like that. I think also if you look at things like coastal, the island of Ireland, I keep saying this, it's an island. What we can do with our coastlines, what we can do with our rivers, what we can do with our wetlands, there's a huge amount that can be done that can hugely help in terms of mitigation, that can improve quality of life, that can improve protection. But somehow people need to start paying attention to the geography and not just to the history on this island.
Thanks, John. Now, before we move to the audience Q&A, and I have a couple of questions picked out there. My final question, I'd like to ask both of you to maybe give a one-liner in response that can be ringing in all of our ears as we go away from today's event. So my final question is simply, what's the single most important contribution that each of us can make now? So, Sive, please.
Well, I had three. So you're making me decide. Okay, I will say.
Give your three.
Okay, firstly, where is your pension fund invested? If you are lucky enough to have a pension, there's a strong possibility in Ireland that your pension fund is not being invested in anything close to green infrastructure or good green stuff. So make inquiries and move it if you can. Second thing, eat less or no meat and dairy. That's a personal level action that can make a big difference to one's personal carbon impact. And thirdly, vote for parties and candidates that are committed to climate action. We underestimate our power as voters sometimes to just organise ourselves to make that kind of collective impact in the electoral system.
Thanks, Sive. John.
I think Sive has said it. The main thing is to pay attention to this. in every aspect of our lives, and whatever that means, whoever you are, whatever your way of life, or you know, you're a campaigner, you're a scientist, you're a lawyer, pay attention to this thing. I think about it, in paying attention, think about it as the people in Ireland in the 1870s who decided to imagine what an Ireland of the future could look like, and they set up cooperatives and theatres, and they started writing about our identity and working and looking at the language and thinking about buildings that would serve municipally for the cities that were there. Pay attention to it in every way, and I think whatever part of society you're in, just talk about it and ask questions and demand, and this is the political question. I'm reading an awful lot about what's going on in the opinion polls and what people think. I don't see anything about the future of the island that is clear or descriptive enough, that is as clear as the threat to the future that people are facing. So demand more. Anybody coming around looking for your vote, looking whoever they are, whichever side of the spectrum, ask for specifics. You know, what's going to happen in my city? You know, how are we going to do something? What's the plan? What do you think Ireland would look like in agriculture? And part of that has to be inclusive. That's the other thing. We didn't get onto the just transition too much. One of the things I worry about, because it's a game that we see played at international level, is you just have people fighting each other out. So the farmers have to fight against the city dwellers and all the rest. The thing is to bring people into the tent and say, right, what if, let's imagine we prioritized a much better life in rural Ireland. And we started there with transport and all of the other things that need to be invested to reconcile the biosphere and the economy, build this new bioeconomy on the island of Ireland. Where would we start? So, you know, pay attention, demand practical answers from whoever turns up at your door looking for your vote. And I think just be active and inclusive and do what you can. I think that's whether it's what you eat or how you live or how you move, or just do what you can.
Thanks, John. So I picked out two questions from the audience Q&A, and thanks so much everyone for your questions. I have one question for John and the second question for Scythe. So question for you, John, from an anonymous attendee. Equitably limiting within the Paris Agreement's 1.5 degrees and planetary boundaries requires staying within a rapidly reducing forever carbon budget and within far smaller annual nitrogen and phosphorus nutrient budgets. Politically, how can Ireland and the EU fairly address what is essentially a rationing problem across society and through the next 3 decades?
Well, I think the first thing we can do more first. I think whether you think it's because we're rational or because we purport to have a set of values, and Ireland may not be part of this, but you know, a lot of what is going on in the rest of the world has a history in Europeans going around the place and doing all kinds of things that create the situations and the dynamics. So I think what the European Union is saying, it's saying that for the next 30 years, and this is beyond political cycles, logical cycles of investment and all the rest, that what the European Union has to be for, I mean, I simplify it and say it's about making peace with nature. It's transforming all of its policies as quickly as it can. There's a whole bunch of them yesterday. By the way, I saw they passed a new law on combating environmental crime, or the Commission put it forward. You know, everything is being changed. Mairead McGuinness is working the taxonomy, the assumptions that allow us to invest our money, how the banks operate, taxation systems to the extent that they're at a European level in some ways, making the means available in innovation and science and policy, working on the targets that are there for biodiversity and farming and food and energy and you know, all of the things that are there. So we have to do what we're doing at the moment, which is to turn everything in that direction, and that's what the European Union is doing with its institutions and its laws and its compliance and its incentives. And we have to do it first. And saying we want to be the first, you know, climate neutral continent is all very well, but I think we have to do it fast. And I think the big problem, like a lot of things in the European Union, is the ownership is at the level of, you know, citizens and member states, and the trade-offs, you know, are going to have to be made there. And I think the social justice and the just transition aspect of this is going to be very important. If you talk to our colleagues in Poland and you're saying we're going to shut down your entire region, which is dependent on coal, you know, thanks very much. It's over, folks. We need to find and engage with these regions quickly to find solutions. So we have to do that. And secondly, we have to take everything that we know and everything that we have, and we have to help the southern part of this planet, where what we have done is going to hit hardest, and who have never had a chance to have a crack at a carbon budget, let alone the next generation. And we have to try and help and support and give them the access to the solutions, to the knowledge, the observation, the systems, where the technologies are appropriate. I'm with Sive in saying that expecting technology, to get us out of the hole is not the right answer, but there will be important changes there, and we should share that and not do what we've done in other humanitarian situations and look after ourselves and extract rents, when actually what we need to do is to move things forward together. So maybe that's a bit too long of an answer, but I think we have to move fast, and we have to move first, and we're going to have to keep moving faster than we think and deeper than we think, but then events are going to explain that to us quite quickly.
Thanks, John, and that answer in fact links very well to the final question I'm going to put, which is to you, Sive, from Maeve Delargy. Thanks, Maeve. How do you work on this and not get depressed? The facts are stark and scary. Do you think if more and more extreme weather events happen, people will agree or ask government to impose the necessary changes?
Well, I do get depressed. I mean, I'm human like anybody else. And I think if you're working in this area and it's just a relentless barrage of not just bad news, but bad news on geological scales, is overwhelming. But one thing I will say is that I would have been suffering from eco-anxiety of a sort in the 1980s about the potential for nuclear war to break out and the prospects for any kind of sustainable future even then. So some of us who experienced that anxiety during the Cold War are kind of conditioned to understanding this fear of processes that you cannot control or influence. But unlike the Cold War, where an Irish person really couldn't do an awful lot about it, we can actually have an influence over shaping the future. Now, we can't prevent some of the climate change that's already baked in, but we can certainly learn to adapt to that and cope with the effects of climate change fairly and in solidarity with those countries that are most vulnerable. That's the first thing. And we can certainly stop putting more greenhouse gases emissions into the atmosphere. Now, that is easier said than done. My discipline is now firmly in politics, and I understand all the constraints and the barriers to getting collective action and institutions and international agreements to be effective on this. But I do find that if on the political level, and in terms of, actually on the political level, I see a lot to be optimistic about in some senses, because you can there's lots of check boxes you can tick in terms of progress being made on this, that, and the other, new commitments, pledges, NDCs, lots of things to report. What gets me down is actually the cultural level, funnily enough, the sense that there isn't just this mass awareness, that people like me, and there's many of us in Ireland who are active on climate stuff all the time, but we are a tiny, tiny percentage of the population. And sometimes we get told, oh, well, nobody wants to listen to you because it's all doomy and nobody wants to hear bad news. If you can only frame it in a positive way and paint a picture of what the beautiful world we're going to create. But I don't know how to do that, actually, because I think that we need to hit the alarm button. As Greta Thunberg says, the house is on fire. We have to run. We have to get the water. We have to put it out. So I don't understand why the alarm isn't more present in our culture. And that distresses me, funnily, more than anything else. And I'll just finish by saying, I posted this kind of, just very innocuous tweet a couple of days ago about the Thwaites Glacier. And it must have touched a nerve, because I've never experienced anything like the response. I got over 3,000 likes and people all over the world commenting on why they think it didn't get any traction in the media and in public awareness, that this massive event is taking place that we can't really control. and that it's going to have an enormous impact on sea levels. And it sparked a huge discussion. So it made me realize that there is a latent appetite out there in the public to discuss things, but we're not giving people the tools, the information, the education to support that kind of conversation that's very difficult, and it's kind of scary and potentially depressing, but we're not tooling people up for that. So people are getting finding it easy to opt out by just, click over to Netflix instead. YouTube has more interesting things on offer. And so I don't really have a solution for it, but I find that as working in politics and as a social scientist, social change is what we do. You just get up and you do it. We just have to make it happen. We may fail, but we still have to keep going.
Thanks, Said. Yeah, I mean, as the IPCC said, every action counts. 1.5 is better than 2, 2 is better than 2.1. So, yeah. There's always something to fight for, of course, when it comes to climate change and biodiversity loss. So it only remains for me to say a huge thank you for a fascinating discussion, and I'm going to pass to you now, Taz.
Thanks very much, Andrew. Yeah, to echo those thanks to all three of you for such an enlightening conversation. I found it really interesting from the outset, actually, to hear John talking about his development of systems thinking through studying English and the power of narrative, both of which are actually a feature of my research these days as a collaborating marine ecologist, and central also to the kind of interdisciplinary degree program in sustainability that we've recently established, drawing on input from all 6 of UCD's colleges, including the College of Arts and Humanities. And I have long-standing collaboration with English scholars, so I know very well what you're talking about, that capacity to see things differently and relay the message and interpret the messages differently. I thought there were also really fascinating reflections on political and societal structures and processes, which also touched on the limits to the influence of the UN, despite the stark words of its Secretary General. I mean, it's clear we're facing huge challenges in relation to climate and biodiversity, and our only way to address them really is to find ways to cooperate on some level as a collective of nations, regions, communities, and individuals, or at least become better aligned in our thinking and our actions, guided perhaps by the broad framework of the Sustainable Development Goals, many of which are relevant and interlinked here, even if they're not, climate and biodiversity aren't right there in the titles. So we really need transformative systemic change to make this happen across the broad spectrum of human activity. And although people are coming around, we really need to find a way to get everyone inside the tent rather than arguing outside it or ignoring it altogether. And so while we are making some commitments and progress, there are clearly many important steps that can be taken and people willing to take them. We have not yet stopped digging our own graves, and we really clearly need a step up in action and urgency. So I thought it was really a wonderful discussion, and thanks very much indeed for that. So thanks also to everyone for tuning in and to listen today, and for all the questions and comments that were flowing throughout. We didn't get to too many questions, but I hope that you found the answers enlightening and the conversation enlightening in its own right. I certainly did. So a recording of this event is going to be available tomorrow on our YouTube channel, along with other episodes in the UCD in Conversation series, so the UCD alumni channel. And so just before I wrap up, I just want to let you know that we'll be continuing these discussions in January, kicking off on Thursday the 13th of January at 1 o'clock. And we'll be discussing how to build a sustainable future with business. And I'll be joined by alumni Ali Sheridan, who is a prominent sustainability and climate consultant, and Laura Costello, who's the strategic director at Think House. And this conversation is going to be led by the Vice Principal for Research and Innovation in the UCD College of Business, which is Professor Donna Marshall. And you can reserve your spot through the UCD alumni contact points, and I think that the link is going to be posted in the chat. But in the meantime, thanks again to everyone, and I hope you all have a wonderful Christmas or festive celebration, whatever that may be. So I look forward to seeing you in the new year.